Hi, everybody. Welcome back to episode 2 of Co-op Perspectives. We're here with legendary journalist from the Boston Globe, Walter Robinson. Thanks again for being here. This is really exciting for me. This is really exciting for Northeastern. But I do want to start all the way back at the beginning. What made you want to attend Northeastern in the first place?
Well, back when I came here, this is probably decades before Northeastern deservedly had a national reputation. It was the university I could afford. And I was attracted to the co-op program. So I started here in '63, didn't do that well, dropped out for a year, came back, did better my sophomore year, but I lost my student draft deferment.
Oh, okay.
And I ended up in the Army for 4 years.
Oh, wow.
To include, of course, a year in Vietnam. And so I came back here at the age of 25. Got a co-op job as an intern reporter at the Globe.
Wow.
And I had a co-op several years earlier at the Lawrence Eagle Tribune. Back then it was 3 months of school and 3 months of co-op. And I managed to work it into a full-time job because they always needed help, and there was always a 5 p.m. to 1 a.m. shift available.
Okay.
And so I managed to make myself part of the wallpaper. When I graduated in '74, I was hired right on the staff. And I remember the managing editor called me in and he said, we've got a staff job for you. That's the good news. The bad news is it's midnight to 8. But, I think without the co-op experience, without that opportunity, maybe I'd still be waiting in line hoping to get a job at the Globe. Do the math. I started there as a co-op in January of '72, and it's 2024, so that's 52 years. So, and the co-op experience for me and for many others opened a world that I might never have had access to. I went up the ladder, so to speak: City Hall Bureau, State House Bureau, national politics, presidential campaigns, Washington correspondent, and I was Middle East correspondent during the first Persian Gulf War. And I was posted to Jerusalem just before Iraq invaded Kuwait. How's that for timing? Moved back to Boston as a city editor. It was my first editing role, and then became a metropolitan editor. I did that for 3 years, and that wore a lot of tread off the tires. And then the Globe gave me a position of roving national and foreign correspondent. So I did a fair amount of reporting overseas, and then took over the Spotlight team. Did it for 7 years, and some of the stuff we did turned out pretty well.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, I think this is not an overstatement. None of that would have been possible or could have come about without the co-op experience.
Yeah. So while a co-op at the Boston Globe, I'm just curious, did you want to get sort of in the political sphere? Was that like a choice you had, or was it just kind of like, as you said, there was a midnight to 8 a.m. shift?
Well, I got into politics because, for a couple of reasons. I grew up in a family where my father was a Republican, my mother was a Democrat, and we got 2 papers. So we talked about politics and current events. So I was always interested in the news. And one thing I learned fairly quickly when I got to the Globe is that virtually all of the senior editors went up the political ladder. So that fit my interests, and that's the ladder I got on.
You mentioned that you won your first investigative journalism award as a co-op while you were a student at Northeastern.
Right.
Do you remember this? I'm sure you remember the story, but what was that story? That's really interesting.
The story was about bookie joints.
Really?
The Commonwealth of Massachusetts instituted the lottery. It was called the Numbers back then.
Okay.
And it was controlled by the mafia.
Okay.
And there were all sorts of places you could bet. And one place you could bet, I found out, was within the Boston Globe. There were actually, trades guys who took bets. But I was actually in school at the time, and one of the senior editors who was a bit of a mentor for me, and by the way, also a Northeastern co-op grad.
Oh, no way.
Jack Driscoll, he took an interest in me, and this opportunity came up. They needed an extra reporter on this investigation, and he asked me if I'd be willing to do it. And of course, I couldn't say no to that. The reporting involved going into these bar rooms with another reporter at noon or 1 o'clock every day, drinking a long neck at noontime, which is not something I would normally do.
Yeah.
And placing bets and, recording the fact that there was so-called illegal gambling going on. All of those experiences would, without co-op, would not have been possible.
I am curious what kind of skills maybe you developed while on co-op at the Boston Globe that maybe you were able to transfer and sort of develop once you were hired full-time.
There are a lot of disciplines where on-the-job training or co-op gives them a substantial leg up over their peers who go to other universities. And journalism is an obvious example of that. I mean, you could sit in a classroom forever, but the only way to learn how to do it is to do it.
Gotcha.
And that's the benefit of co-op. The Globe has, for decades and decades, has been a terrific co-op employer and a great place for students to live.
How have you seen the co-op program change and develop since you were a co-op to now being an employer of co-ops?
I always looked for Northeastern students because most of them had a prior co-op where they had some experience.
Yeah.
And that wasn't necessarily true of students at places like Suffolk or Emerson or BU. And so the Northeastern students, and there's something about the program, specifically the journalism program at Northeastern, that attracts kids who really want to do it. They want to do journalism, and they come to Northeastern because they know they can get to do it. And those kids are almost always really great hires. There's still a fairly steady stream of kids from Northeastern who come into that newsroom and they get to write stories for the Boston Globe. They get their bylines, they learn a lot, and they almost always acquit themselves extraordinarily well. When journalism students get their degrees, most places, not Northeastern, but most places, and they go to interview for a job, the first question any hiring editor will ask, well, let me see your clips. And they don't have them. But when a Northeastern student, graduate, applies and they say, let me see your clips, they've got a bag full of them.
Yeah.
And more likely than not, the first job out of Northeastern is at probably a small daily paper somewhere, not the Globe. And having clips from the Globe is an extraordinary inducement for any editor to hire them.
Speaking of the foundation of careers, what is the story behind getting tapped on the shoulder to lead the Spotlight team?
So as a new reporter, you're given kind of stories that you have to dig deep inside the paper, and they're short. They're not the most important stories of the day. And I said, even this little story I've been given to do, I can make that better. I can find out stuff that maybe would elevate the story. And so I started to get these little assignments, and I would dig deep and get a much fuller story, and they ended up running the stories on the Metro front or on Page One. So then they started to give me more important stories to do, even when I was a co-op. And I mean, the secret to my success was always to look at a story, particularly stories that are being so-called fed to us by people in power, and say, what's the real story behind this? And then I would go after it. And I did that for a very long time, and with with a lot of success. I think I had close to 2,000 page one stories in my career.
Wow.
It's a lot. And, but many of those, or maybe most of those, were stories that I had to dig out, and sometimes against, pretty substantial odds. So nobody ever called me an investigative reporter.
Okay.
And I never thought of myself as an investigative reporter. I thought of myself as a pretty good reporter. But I always tell my students, every good reporter is an investigative reporter. Because our job is to dig out the stories that people we cover don't want us to know about.
Right.
And people who do that are valued in any newsroom. So that's how I think the co-op, coming in as an intern reporter, really, I was motivated to dig deeper. Not only because I wanted to get good stories, but because I wanted to get ahead.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with that.
With your story about the church, and it captures the attention of the American zeitgeist to the point where, you're portrayed in a movie, you're winning the Pulitzer Prize for public service. I am curious, as a journalist, do those acknowledgments and those achievements kind of compound on the fact that you told a good story, or at the end of the day, is it, I made an impact, this was a great story, and I'm very, very happy with what I did?
I think it's all of those. It's all of those things. I mean, it's in any field, it's always great to be recognized. To us, the Pulitzer Prize for public service, because of the impact that our stories had on Catholics, not just Catholics, but particularly Catholics everywhere, and on the church. And I like to think sometimes, maybe because of the journalism, there was some number of children who did not get abused. And to me, that's reward enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, the prizes and the movies be damned, knowing that you've done some good that helps people.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing.
Especially now with, you have mediums and platforms like podcasts, social media. Technology is kind of everywhere. How would you say you take a different approach to it?
Journalism has changed. But the technology has made it possible, number one, to get a lot more information much more quickly. I mean, I can give you one example.
Okay.
If I'm trying to trace somebody's property records, it used to be that I had to go spend a day or two in the Registry of Deeds. Now I can do that same work that would take 2 days, I can do it in 20 minutes online. Across the craft of journalism, there are many, many examples of that, where you can get data, really good data, to enhance any story that you couldn't get 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And journalists nowadays, I think, given the changes in the economics of the profession, journalists need to be, and most young journalists are, more entrepreneurial.
Okay.
They typically come out of programs like Northeastern with the kind of multimedia backgrounds that nobody of my generation had. You were either a reporter or you were a photographer. But now you have reporters who know how to do audio, they know how to do video.
Interesting.
They can do photography. So on any given story, important story nowadays, a reporter can actually get it much quicker.
As we had mentioned before, you were a distinguished professor of journalism here at Northeastern, and you spearheaded the initiative for investigative journalism. What was the inspiration to help give Northeastern journalism students that sort of experience?
Well, when I agreed to come here, and I had pretty much done everything I wanted to do full time at the Globe. The deal was, I wouldn't teach students the basics. Okay. I would take the best students in the journalism program and we would do real investigative stories. That's how they would learn investigative reporting. The Globe would run the stories. So this was obviously a win-win for Northeastern, the journalism school, the students who loved the bylines, particularly on a page one investigative story, and for the Globe.
Yeah.
And so it worked well for everybody. And the 7 years that I taught here, we had 26 page one investigative
Wow.
stories that the students did.
That's incredible.
And
Wow.
I was their editor. Sometimes I was tough on them, but they knew what they were doing.
That's incredible.
Partly because almost all of them had prior co-ops at the Globe and other places where they had actually done reporting.
Gotcha.
So it wasn't like their first rodeo. Well, I want to take a second and say thank you to Northeastern for making this possible and for bringing in students who, by the way, are a hell of a lot smarter than I was at their age. Kids who want to do this work and are capable of doing it, and they come to an institution that makes it all possible.
Thank you so much, Robbie.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure chatting with you today.